I can't stop thinking about
the baby.
Wondering where I could be, who he is with, what is he thinking? Is he thinking of me? And whether he'll ever return someday.
You have to stop lying awake, wondering about
the baby.
Wondering where he is, what he's thinking, if he's thinking of you and...
Remember me?
Take a look at any ranking of the best games ever made and you'll get an eyeful of Mario, Zelda, and Metroid titles. These are among Nintendo's oldest franchises, with some of their most influential games. But take a look at Nintendo's sales history and a different story emerges. Mario prints money. Zelda is a major success, and Metroid doesn't even crack the top 10, selling only a sliver of what Zelda has. And it's hard to answer exactly why that gap is so large. The series hasn't had much less impact than the others. The indie genre is practically one giant Metroid tribute, and plenty of major studios have taken ideas from Samus. In the beginning, the games struggled to attract Japanese players, and though they sold better in the West, the numbers were weak next to Mario and Zelda. After Super Metroid became the third game in a row to fall below expectations, Nintendo put it on the shelf for a while.
Hey asshole, what are you doing?
But they didn't give up. It was a slow burn, but Super Metroid narrowly managed to make the Player's Choice collection. These were games that had sold 1 million copies and dropped to $20 to celebrate. It didn't hurt that Samus was included in Smash Bros., as this may have introduced her to more players than her own games combined. After 8 years of time for word of mouth to spread, the stage was set for Metroid Prime to become the biggest commercial success in the series, but even those sales were nothing special, and Nintendo could only maintain a tenuous hold on that audience with sequels.
Why am I still alive?
Whatever the reason for its marginalization is, it's clear that Metroid has been kept alive by a small but devoted fan base, and the series will live or die according to whether Nintendo makes the games that these fans want to buy. And for the past decade, they've kind of dropped that ball. Before talking about what went wrong, I'll try to establish what right is for a Metroid game. You may disagree, but I think Metroid can be distilled down to these 3 core elements. Exploration means that the player isn't just moving from point A to point B. Everything in Metroid is point B. Though the actual path through the environment is fairly linear, it doesn't feel that way because the player is absorbing the entirety of the world as they go along. It's not just about finding the one door that's unlocked and going through, but making notes of the terrain, objects of interest, the obstructions. Where can't you go, and why can't you go there? You need to know these things so that when you get a power-up you can have that moment of, aha, I can go back and do that now. Navigation should be such a test to the player's memory and perception that they should be able to draw a map of it all from heart when it's over. This missile tank is a good example of how Metroid games are designed. Its placement out in the open misleads the player into thinking it might be easy to get, only for them to waste a minute of their time and leave disappointed. But the developers didn't do this just to be dicks. They knew that frustration would cause the player to remember this room, so that when they got the grapple beam they'd be sure to come back and finally get the tank, and in turn be led right into the wrecked ship, the next area of the game. In this way, the developer's unseen hand guides players through the world. You know where you want to go, but not really why, and it's important that the developer's fingerprints remain invisible, so that the achievement of figuring things out can feel like your own. After entering Meridia, players expecting to find a shiny new area to explore are instead dumped back into a previous one. What's going on? The only path forward turned out to be a dead end, but the answer has already been seen. A broken pipe passed by in Meridia matches exactly with the one in the next room, creating an almost subliminal impression that this can be destroyed. The map found at Meridia also adds squares above and below the tube, suggesting that the player can enter that space. It may stump you for a while, but when you put the pieces together and break this tube, it's one of the most rewarding moments in the game, because you feel like you overcame a tough obstacle on your own. But you're never entirely alone.
When you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all.
The Resident Evil developers have referred to their games as Metroidvanias, so let's go with that. In these games, your progress is limited by keys. Obtaining a new one unlocks a new set of areas to explore, where the next key will be found. In Metroid, the keys are your power-ups themselves, and unlike Resident Evil, they're not disposable. The key that lets you open this door also lets you open a hole in an enemy's face.
I like that.
Getting new upgrades is fun, and the ensuing ability to enter areas that were previously blocked is fun. The gameplay is driven by this cycle of powering up and exploration, and the longer it goes on, the more powerful Samus becomes, until by the end of the game she's like an entirely different character. Compare Samus at the beginning of Super Metroid to Samus at the end. The player has earned this power by defeating bosses and seeking out hidden areas. It's important that the player remains in control of this progress. They need to feel like they're fighting against an alien world alone, unraveling it one upgrade at a time. When an obstruction comes along, the player needs to take it as a personal challenge to explore more and find the item that's out there waiting for them. The importance of power-ups in Super Metroid can be seen through a glitch that allows players to restart the game with all their suit upgrades. After landing on Zebes, all of the rules go out the window. You can go straight to Norfair and kill Ridley first. The only area that's off limits is Turian, but even this obstruction is under your control. Just find the bosses. The fact that items are so powerful leads to sequence breaking, where collecting an item early lets players get farther than intended at that time. Nintendo tries to crack down on this in the newer games, but in a way sequence breaking means that the game is on the right track, because items are being given the appropriate power in the game design. It doesn't matter how well laid out the map is or how fun the power-ups are. If the world is boring, the game will be a failure. One of the ways the original Metroid shows its age the most is that rooms repeat so much. Some people still like the challenge this game poses, but the exploration is hardly interesting when every room looks the same, and the navigation is confused because this room could be one of 6 in the area. Compare this to Super Metroid's Brinstar. The first area is overgrown with green vines, while the very next room changes to a wildly different scene with fluttering flower petals. A few rooms later and the game's tone has changed once again, all while adhering to the same vague plant theme, and there are other shifts to see beyond that. There's practically as much variation in this one area as there was in all of Metroid 1. This helps keep the player interested in the world, but it also aids exploration by giving the player landmarks to go by. Even without a map, and in spite of being a larger game, Super Metroid would still be simpler to navigate than Metroid 1 because of how distinct every environment is. In the service of creating interesting worlds, Metroid titles often go beyond the standards of detail for their time. Super Metroid's Shriek Bats have piles of droppings beneath them. Parasites scatter from a body when approached. Creatures reveal tunnels in the walls. A mother alien attacks you when you approach her young. Water droplets are kicked up in damp areas, and Samus's visor glows with some kind of night vision in the dark. The hard-to-see light on her hand also glows with it. The broken turret sockets in this room could be used as an alternate attack to electrocute the boss, whose young then carry the body away. Metroid Prime impressed with scan logs for everything on the planet, visor effects that put the player inside Samus's helmet, and the generally insane level of detail put into the worlds. Someone at Retro worked their ass off to put interesting things into every corner of the game, and that's the level of commitment that's needed to make a world seem like a living ecosystem. The player has to believe that if they look somewhere, they'll be rewarded for the effort. The games also need emotional impact. The player should be so absorbed in the world that they want to stop in their tracks just to soak it in from time to time. When Samus returns to Zebes, a thunderstorm and ominous soundtrack set the mood right away. The world seems deserted. The player knows a threat exists, but the longer it takes to appear, the more and more the tension grows. Any of that sound familiar?
Okay, Pharaoh, take us in low over the main colony complex. Storm shutters are sealed. There's no visible activity.
Metroid borrowed heavily from the Alien movies, but the big difference is that Metroid is a game. Instead of just watching, the player has to plunge themselves into the danger, and the music and visuals do heavy lifting to create and enhance the feelings along the way. After beating the first boss, the player returns to the surface to find that the rain has stopped, and the threatening score has been replaced with Samus Aran's theme. Where the player was once intimidated, they've persevered and established control. Moments like this define who Samus is. We don't need dialogue or cutscenes to tell us because we've lived as the character through the unfolding game design. You can clearly see these three elements when comparing Super Metroid and Metroid Prime. On the surface, Prime plays nothing like Super. Samus is slow and stiff, moving only at a jog. She can only make the simplest jumps, and iconic abilities like the Speed Booster never appeared. But Metroid Prime did have the puzzle-like exploration, the emphasis on collecting power-ups, and all the atmosphere the GameCube could render. Prime proved that it doesn't matter if it's 2D, 3D, first person, or whatever. As long as these elements are the focus, anything could be a Metroid game. In fact, you don't even need Samus or Metroids. Axiom Verge is a Metroid game. It may have a different character on screen, but the core game design is the same. Indie developers have done a great job of breaking down what Metroid is and expressing that essence in their own ways. In fact, it seems like the only developer really struggling with what Metroid is about is Nintendo.
Never again would I encounter the baby. The baby. The baby. That baby. The baby. The infant Metroid. And the baby.
Yoshio Sakamoto intended for Other M to tell a story right from the start. He had a small role supervising Retro Studios in terms of telling them which ideas were and weren't appropriate for Metroid. And if you think Retro Studios has no bad ideas, one of their concepts was for a serial killer baby AI to kidnap Samus and subject her to psychological torture in another dimension. Maybe having to explain who Samus was and wasn't to another studio made him regret never explicitly defining who the character was in the games. Whatever the reason, Other M set out to do just that. Other M is a fun enough action game on its own, and it does something that Metroid Prime never managed to. It gives us a fast Samus that does handle like the same character from the 2D games. But judge it by the standards that we've established, and the problems appear right away. Exploration is extremely guided and linear, with the navigation rooms setting beacons every step of the way. The beacons are only a few rooms apart, and those rooms are almost always in a straight line with no variation. The game rarely requires you to go off the beaten path in order to move forward. The exploration is compartmentalized to small areas at a time, and you're usually told where to go and when to go there.
Samus, go through the hatch on your right and head towards Sector 1.
The main sector's locked to limit you to the one that Adam has authorized at a given time,
What's wrong? Head to Sector 1.
denying you the ability to backtrack when you get a new item.
What's wrong? Head to Sector 1.
And doors regularly lock behind you to close off explored areas. There's not much use in inspecting the environments when you're limited by things that you have no power to unlock. This part of the game leads to a dead end that contains nothing of interest other than a short cutscene. Then the player is forced to turn back, not because they got a new power-up that can break through an obstacle, because they're stuck. They have no choice but to give up. And then, the door just opens for no reason.
Samus, proceed through the hatch I just unlocked.
No achievement, nothing solved. The player is just arbitrarily stumbling forward because the game says it's time to do so. Samus slowly explores this building with a Resident Evil-style camera, only to once again hit a dead end and be interrupted by a cutscene.
Everybody get in here!
When the scene is over, she has to begin exploring all over again, only to end up in a practically identical room for a fight to take place. So why not just have this fight the first time? Because the pieces of a narrative are being delivered, and the game needs to give you busy work in between them. After beating Sector 3's boss, the player is locked out of the elevator,
Samus, continue your investigation of that sector.
only to end up at a dead end a few rooms later and be turned back once again.
Okay, Samus, head to Sector 2.
So why not let the player in here the first time? I assume they wanted players to see the grapple hook, but why bother? Players aren't navigating by memory anymore. They'll receive a beacon that tells them exactly when to come back. You're never in control of your own progress, never thinking your own way through the world like you should be. The game is in control, and it's almost as if it's jerking you around like this to deliberately make you feel lost and powerless.
You don't move unless I say so, and you don't fire until I say so.
Power-ups are also drained of their reward. Instead of finding them, Adam authorizes you to use them,
Samus, use your ice beam.
often at the most arbitrary times.
Samus, activate the barrier feature on your suit to protect yourself from heat damage.
I was using the bathroom. Did I miss anything? Samus!
With no achievement linked to collecting abilities, it almost feels as if they're not yours, that Adam could revoke them at any time.
The most efficient way through here should be delivering shoulder impacts with your speed booster.
So, I've got the speed booster now, or? Yay! The power-ups also don't have much strength in the game design. If you were to restart the game with every ability, as we did in Super Metroid, you'd still be standing around waiting for these doors to unlock. To be fair, some of these problems began with Metroid Fusion, which also used beacons and locked players within certain sectors at a time. But Fusion got away with this because it didn't diminish power-ups and exploration to the same extent, and it also had an excellent atmosphere. Other M has the sinister tone, but it never evolves or has emotional impact. Most of the soundtrack is just spooky white noise. Longtime Metroid composer Kenji Yamamoto wasn't suited to dramatic cutscenes, so anime composer Kuniaki Haishima was brought in instead. He's a great composer, but he's not well suited to the actual gameplay. Compare the amount of heart in these tracks. Not that he had much to work with. The game's 3 sections can be described as metallic hallways with plants, metallic hallways with frost, and metallic hallways with lava. Only a handful of rooms really managed to impress with their imagination. In a Metroid game, every room should be as cool as this, not just a rare few. The story doesn't matter. Even if it had been a masterpiece, the game still would have failed as a Metroid due to the gameplay being subjugated in favor of that story. It wouldn't make sense to find power-ups on a Federation ship, so they get authorized instead. The gravity suit couldn't appear in-game because it looked too silly in the cinematic moments, so it had to be cut. The frequent cutscenes determined the progress instead of the player's own actions. But the fan reaction centered on the story and sexism, and that controversy is what Nintendo heard the most of. The backlash was so bad that Yoshio Sakamoto signaled that he was leaving the series, and Nintendo didn't even acknowledge Metroid's 25th anniversary, even while proudly doing so for Mario and Zelda. Metroid once again entered years of radio silence. Then, Nintendo showed us that they had learned from the mistake of releasing a story-based Metroid that ignored the series' principles, by releasing a story-based Metroid that ignored the series' principles. Other M did a weak job, but Federation Force isn't even on the map. There's no large-scale exploration or backtracking, as the game is broken into missions that are mere minutes long. There's no power-up collection, with players instead unlocking first-person shooter-style perks, and the atmosphere is...
Over here! Over here! Over here! Over here! Over here!
I could kinda watch this all day.
Over here!
It was apparently intended to build up the Federation troopers, since they might factor heavily in the next Prime game, but what do they matter in terms of game design? Was anyone asking for the next Metroid to revolve around the guys who tell you that doors are off limits?
The next Metroid will take place on... Sir? Is this the Federation thing? Is the Federation thing again? Alright. I'm tired of this shit. You want the Federation?
Luckily, the game Nintendo should have released was just a little further down the road. Samus Returns wasn't even announced in Nintendo's E3 Direct that year. Nintendo must have wanted to avoid making a big splash because they were afraid it would lead to another big outrage, but lo and behold, the fans weren't outraged, and it's not really a mystery why. Samus Returns has exploration. Like the original, it's segmented into cave systems that you explore to hunt Metroids. The Metroids are tracked by clues in the environment, like shed skins, and with a beeping that grows more intense when one is near. The game usually doesn't care which order you take them out in, making it less rigidly linear than some games in the series. Beacons aren't set on the map by default, but the option to manually create them is there if you get stuck. The game grants a scan pulse ability that reveals weaknesses in walls. This might raise the eyebrows of a hardcore fan, but the ability doesn't really give away puzzles, and mainly saves the player from having to bomb every surface to find clues. It's like Super Metroid's X-ray scope, but with an energy limit. The sections also never lock themselves behind the player, and backtracking is easier than it's ever been thanks to the new teleporting statues. In general, the game lets players find their own way and get lost. The game has a wealth of power-ups to collect, and they're almost always the driver of your progress. You're constantly seeing things that you know you'll be coming back to later, and later is whenever the hell you want it to be. It also seems like starting the game over with every upgrade would really fuck things up, just the way it should be. The only obstacles your power-ups can't clear are the Metroid statues, but finding and killing the Metroids is entirely under your control. It's the same as the boss statues from the old games, just on a smaller scale. Atmosphere is the only element the game struggles with. It's impressive enough for a polygonal game on a last-gen handheld, but it struggles to match either the charm of the sprite-based games or the detail of the Prime games. The early environments are fairly repetitive, but major shifts do start happening about halfway through the game. Enemy variety is also limited, and you'll be doing a whole lot of this until the very end. But in spite of these faults, the game manages to draw the player into the world enough to achieve the sort of hypnotic immersion the series is known for, and the mood has much more variation and strength than other M. Fuck it. Good enough. There's room to argue over how the game turned out as a remake, but there's no arguing that Samus Returns is a true Metroid game, designed around the ideas that made the series what it is, and it's great to see Yoshio Sakamoto return to make it. Where will Metroid go from here? Will Prime 4 continue on this path, or will it get sidetracked by another story that no one really asked for? Mario is a plumber because they needed a mustache and overalls to make his nose and arms visible. Samus turns into a ball because they couldn't animate her crawling. These games date to a time when gameplay came first and story was just an afterthought, and Nintendo's recent struggles are because they've gotten that relationship reversed.
Bottom line, America.
Nintendo needs to make Metroids that are focused on the essentials again. And buy 'em this time, you dickheads.